Hey there, welcome back. Tonight, we're taking a quiet journey through one of the oldest companions of humanity. Not war, not hunger, but illness. By watching this video, you'll learn how plagues shaped civilizations, inspired prayers, and taught humankind the meaning of fragility. From the first whispered fevers beside a campfire to the great pandemics that reshaped empires, this story is as old as breath itself. So let's slow down, breathe a little, and take a closer look at what life was really like when sickness first spoke. All you have to do is settle in, pull the blanket a little closer, and let the story drift over you, like a faint wind moving through the reeds at night. Before we begin, I'd like to share something small. If you enjoy these calm journeys through history, consider leaving a like or subscribing, only if it feels right. Now, let's step softly into the beginning, a time before memory, when fear itself had no name. The world was quiet then, no kingdoms, no temples, only the scattered fires of early people beneath the vast, breathing sky. They did not know the words for infection or contagion. They only knew that sometimes a hunter did not rise with the dawn, that sometimes a mother's breath grew shallow and still, though the stars still turned above. In the darkness, they built small rituals. They rubbed herbs over fevered skin, sang to the spirits of the air, and drew shapes in the dust, circles to ward off what they could not see. Around the bodies of the dead, they scattered ochre and ash, hoping to color the spirit's path to safety. Disease was not yet an enemy. It was a visitor, mysterious and terrible, a reminder that life was borrowed from something greater. The first plagues were not in cities. They lived in the closeness of families, in the caves and river valleys where people shared warmth. A single cough could move from one mouth to another. A ghost carried on the breath. They learned to fear what could not be touched. They buried their own with distance, leaving food and tools beside the body, believing the spirit might still hunger, still wander. As centuries passed, people gathered, villages rose from mud and timber. They began to till the earth, keep animals, store grain, and with each closeness came something unseen. Rats, fleas, flies. The pulse of civilization had begun, and with it, the heartbeat of epidemic life. Under a pale moon, a fever swept through a village on the edge of the steppe. It moved like a whisper, first one, then another. Children stopped laughing. Fires burned longer at night, their smoke curling over the huts like mourning veils. The people thought the wind was angry, or the gods were testing their patience. They prayed to the moon, to the bones of their ancestors, to anything that would listen. They did not know that inside the blood, tiny kingdoms of life and death were waging war, that a single droplet of water, shared between friends, could carry the weight of 1,000 unseen battles. They only knew that when the cough came, the songs grew softer, and yet they endured. They always did. When the fever left, the survivors gathered the bones and burned herbs over them, sage, thyme, and smoke that clung to their skin. In that act, there was both grief and gratitude. Grief for what was lost, gratitude for what remained. Time stretched. Generations learned patterns, how sickness came with rain, or with strangers, or with the stillness of summer air. They began to assign meaning. Some thought the gods walked among them, angry or sorrowful. Others believed the earth itself was breathing illness through its soil. Every culture began to craft stories, not just to explain death, but to make it bearable. In the caves of France, bones show signs of ritual, skulls painted red, flowers pressed into the earth beside the dead. In the deserts of Africa, ancient burial mounds mark the first quarantines, small groups left apart so others might live. Even then, humanity was learning something profound, that compassion and caution could coexist, that to care for the sick was both holy and dangerous. At night, when the fires died low, the elders told stories of the ones who had vanished. They whispered that the spirits would return if remembered kindly. That memory itself was a cure, and perhaps, in some quiet way, it was, because every act of remembrance, every stone laid over a grave, every song sung for the lost, became the first form of medicine, not a cure of the body, but of the heart. And in that soft, flickering light, humanity found its first defense, connection. Imagine standing there, thousands of years ago, beneath a sky so full of stars it feels alive. You can smell the smoke of the fire, the damp earth beneath your feet. You can hear a child coughing in the distance, and the low hum of a song meant to keep the dark away. It is not fear you feel, not entirely. It is the recognition that to live is to risk the breath of others. To love is to stand close, even when the air itself trembles. The first plagues left no written record, no chronicles or names, only silence and the faint marks of care. Bowls of honey left beside graves, stones arranged in circles, herbs burned in the morning air. But from that silence rose something larger, the beginning of medicine, of ritual, of community. Illness taught humankind to look inward, to understand fragility, to create meaning where none was given. As dawn came, the survivors stepped from their shelters and saw the mist rising from the earth like breath. They began again, planting, weaving, singing. Life, as always, resumed its rhythm, and somewhere in that rhythm, between the cough and the prayer, the story of all pandemics began. Whispers in the Nile, Egypt's curses and remedies. The river was everything. It glittered beneath the rising sun, wide as an ocean and slow as breath itself. Along its banks, reeds shivered in the morning air, and beyond them the desert yawned, endless, gold, and dry. Here, life and death met in rhythm, just as they had for thousands of years. And among the people of the Nile, illness was not simply a misfortune, it was a message. In ancient Egypt, to fall sick was to draw the attention of gods and spirits. The healers called themselves servants of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of plague and protection. When fever struck, they whispered her name in the flickering light of oil lamps, offering incense, honey, and prayer. They believed she could bring disease as easily as she could take it away. Some nights, they said, you could hear her roar echoing across the dunes, a sound carried on the hot wind, half beast, half divine warning. Inside the temples, the air was thick with myrrh and smoke. Priests dipped bronze instruments in palm wine, mixing salves from crushed minerals and herbs, frankincense, garlic, and natron. They traced symbols over the body of the sick, murmuring words older than any language still spoken. Sometimes it worked, or seemed to, and when it didn't, they turned to ritual instead of remedy. The dead were not left behind. They were carefully wrapped, honored, and remembered. Every tomb, every carving, every offering was a form of continuity, a promise that even if the body failed, the soul would cross safely into the field of reeds. Plague in Egypt was never written as a catastrophe. It was a test, woven into the natural cycle of life and renewal. The Nile flooded, the crops rose, the locusts came, the fever followed. People accepted these turns as seasons of the soul, but sometimes something darker stirred, a sickness that spread too fast, leaving entire villages silent. Fishermen stopped returning from the water, scribes abandoned their scrolls mid-line, and the priests, normally certain, began to speak in riddles, as though the gods themselves had grown uncertain. On the stone walls of Saqqara, a text survives, the Book of Healing. It lists symptoms, burning skin, trembling, sores upon the face, and then, softly, the prayer. May the breath of Sekhmet pass over the afflicted. May the shadow depart. It's strange to imagine the same fear, the same tenderness, thousands of years before modern medicine. They were already trying to name what could not be seen, to hold chaos in the form of words. Sometimes the healers took their craft to the banks of the river. There, they used the water itself as medicine. They believed that the Nile's current could draw illness away, that the gods flowed within it. A patient would be bathed at dawn, the water chilled from the night, while the healer recited charms. The cold bit into the skin, and for a moment the fever seemed to flee. Perhaps that moment was enough, not a cure, but a comfort. Egypt's plagues often followed its bounty. When the floods were generous, grain filled the silos and rodents multiplied. Where there were rats, there were fleas. Where there were fleas, there was sickness. The pattern was invisible to them, but the rhythm was known. The people spoke of curses, of wandering spirits released by the flooding of tombs. And yet, within that belief was a kind of wisdom, that all things were connected and balance must be restored. Imagine the night air near Memphis, the scent of lotus and smoke, the soft hiss of insects near the water. A family huddles in their mud brick home, their child burning with fever. Outside, the priest walks barefoot along the shore, carrying a small bronze statue of Bastet, the gentle cat goddess who guards against pestilence. He dips it into the river, whispering for mercy. Above, the stars shimmer like the eyes of watchful gods. The world feels still, suspended between fear and faith. Over centuries, Egyptian healers began to record their remedies in papyrus scrolls. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts in existence, describes infections, tumors, and abscesses. It offers both science and spell. Place meat upon the wound, recite the words, and the body shall remember itself. It is part medicine, part poetry, an early sign that humans needed both explanation and hope. They were already bridging the worlds of reason and ritual, long before those words had names. In the royal courts, disease carried political weight. A sick pharaoh was a trembling universe. Every cough in the palace echoed through the nation. Scribes recorded omens, a scorpion sighted at dusk, a falcon circling the temple. When the king recovered, it was a miracle. When he did not, it was destiny. Death was divine order, not failure. Even the tombs were built as sanctuaries of preservation, as if stone itself could stop decay. And yet, in the silence between rituals, ordinary people mourned like we do now, quietly, with small gestures. A mother pressing a necklace of beads into her child's hand before burial. A husband leaving bread and water at the edge of the desert, hoping the soul might find its way. There is tenderness in these ancient acts, a reminder that compassion is older than civilization itself. The Nile's current carried more than trade and stories. It carried microbes and memory. From one village to the next, people began to notice patterns. They learned to avoid certain waters, to burn the belongings of the dead, to close doors when the cough came. Without knowing it, they were inventing the earliest forms of quarantine. Science and superstition intertwined like reeds in the river, each holding up the other. As centuries passed, Egypt's faith in balance became its medicine. Every sickness was part of the eternal duality, life and death, order and chaos, Ra and the underworld. To heal was to restore harmony. And perhaps that's why, even now, the story of Egyptian plagues feels strangely serene. They did not rage against disease, they folded it into the rhythm of the cosmos. The fever was frightening, yes, but it was also familiar. When the sun finally set over the desert, the temples glowed with firelight. Priests chanted beside the river, their voices rising with the sound of frogs and wind. Somewhere, in the distance, a single torch moved across the dunes. A healer on his way to another house. Another prayer, another life, suspended between breath and silence. And as the stars turned above the Nile, the world kept its balance. Even in sickness, even in sorrow, life continued to flow. Part 3. Ashes of Babylon, Healing in the Age of Kings. The river changes its name, but not its nature. East of Egypt, the twin veins of the Tigris and Euphrates shimmer beneath the sun, drawing life across the plains of Mesopotamia. Here, in the cradle of cities, humanity learned to measure, to write, and to fear. Clay tablets spoke long before paper ever would, and in those faint cuneiform marks, the story of illness took its first written form. The air was heavy with dust and incense. In the courtyards of Babylon, healers, the Ashipu and the Asu, moved between worlds. One spoke to spirits, the other to symptoms. Between them lay the earliest division between faith and science. A fever might be seen as a demon's grip, or the result of bad water. Both explanations felt true, and both required attention, ritual, and care. A patient would lie on a reed mat, the smell of river clay still clinging to their skin. A healer traced symbols in ash along the brow, whispering the names of gods: Nergal, Lord of Plague; Gula, the great physician; Ea, the giver of knowledge. Nearby, a bowl of water reflected the flicker of oil lamps. The healer watched the ripples as if reading an omen, searching for movement that might betray the spirit's restlessness. Then came the herbs: crushed juniper, beer mixed with honey, salt from the edge of the marshes. Each ingredient carried both meaning and memory, gathered under the belief that earth itself could restore balance. In the ruins of Ur, archaeologists found small clay figurines buried beside the sick, offerings to the unseen. Sometimes the figures bore exaggerated limbs, swollen faces, or eyes too large, mirrors of affliction, given to the ground as substitutes for the living. "Take this image instead of me," the gesture seemed to say. It was a bargain with the invisible, and perhaps, in its quiet hope, not so different from modern prayer. The kings of Mesopotamia understood that disease could unmake an empire faster than war. When a plague struck, they sent proclamations through the cities, calling for purification. Temples were washed, idols anointed, and fires lit in every street to cleanse the air. Inscriptions from the time of Hammurabi record commands to isolate the sick, to burn their bedding, to bury the dead beyond the city walls. Justice, law, and healing intertwined. Public health was already a form of governance. At night, the city's walls glowed faintly from countless torches. Families closed their doors and burned cedar wood inside. Children were told not to speak of the sick, as though naming the fever might invite it in. And beyond the walls, jackals called in the desert, their cries answered by silence. Some tablets describe dreams: a man visited by a shadow that breathes on him, leaving his skin cold and pale. He wakes fevered, trembling. The dream becomes a diagnosis. To the people of Babylon, illness was both real and symbolic, a story told through the body. Healing, therefore, was also storytelling, to rewrite the ending, to convince the gods, or the spirit within that peace could be restored. There was wisdom, too, in their observation. They knew that dirty water brought sickness, that stagnant pools bred death. They built canals that breathed, moving water to keep it pure. They learned that proximity mattered. In crowded markets, coughs spread faster. And so, long before the word quarantine, there were walls in waiting. Imagine the morning after a long night of chants. The temple courtyard still hums with the echo of drums. Smoke rises from small fires where herbs smolder, sharp and sweet. A healer dips his fingers in oil and traces a mark upon a patient's wrist, not to diagnose, but to promise endurance. He speaks softly. The sickness has a name, therefore it can be persuaded to leave. There is logic in that faith, a recognition that to name something is to begin mastering it. In one corner of the city, a scribe sits beneath a palm awning, recording the prescriptions of the court physician. He notes the weight of copper, the measure of barley, the mixing of dates and resin. Then, in the same hand, he writes a charm. If the fever does not depart, bind this tablet to the chest. Speak the words thrice under the morning star. It is both science and superstition, line by line, and together they form the first medical textbooks. Centuries drifted like silt. The empires changed, Akkad, Assyria, Babylon again, but the fear remained constant. Each ruler faced the same invisible enemy. Each generation lit the same fires, whispered the same names. Even when cities fell, the memory of healing endured. A clay tablet could outlast a dynasty, and on it the plea, "May the hand of the god be gentle." The great ziggurats, those layered mountains of brick, rose toward the sky as if to bridge heaven and earth. From their heights, priests watched storms sweep across the plains. To them, lightning was cleansing, thunder, divine speech. After each storm, they washed the statues, refreshed the sacred water, and prayed that the air had been purified. They were learning, slowly, the connection between wind, water, and sickness. Even ignorance was progress, for it led to attention. And yet, in the quiet corners of every city, there were still mothers who sang to dying children, still men who left offerings of bread beside the river, still hearts breaking with the same helpless rhythm that beats through all centuries. Progress never silenced grief, it only taught us new languages for it. One tablet tells of a physician who refused to abandon his patient. When the fever came for him, he was buried with his instruments. His pupils placed a bowl of water at his feet, so his soul might continue healing in the afterlife. It is a simple image, but in it lies the seed of modern medicine, oath, to serve even in the shadow of death. When the winds swept across Babylon, they carried both dust and memory. Illness had become part of civilization's foundation, inscribed, recorded, ritualized. The body was no longer just a vessel for the soul, but a text of its own, one that could be read, interpreted, and sometimes rewritten. As the sun sank beyond the horizon, the city glowed like an ember in the vast desert. From the top of a ziggurat, a priest looked out and saw the river gleaming in the distance, winding like a silver thread through the darkness. He whispered a final prayer, not for wealth, not for conquest, but for balance, because even then, in the heart of empire they knew, health was the truest form of peace. The physician and the oracle, Greece and the body, the sea lies quiet, pale blue beneath the morning haze. Somewhere beyond the islands, gulls wheel over fishing boats, their cries sharp against the soft crash of waves. In this world of light and marble, sickness was not only a curse, it was a puzzle. The Greeks believed that to understand the body was to understand the universe itself, and so, for the first time in history, illness began to leave the temple and enter the mind. They called their healers iatroi, physicians, seekers of nature's logic. Before them, others had prayed, sacrificed, and burned incense. Now, men with steady hands and patient eyes watched how the body spoke. The color of the tongue, the rhythm of breath, the temperature of the skin. They began to see patterns, signs that disease followed laws, not whims. It was a quiet revolution, carried out not with swords, but with observation. Still, faith lingered in the air like smoke. The temples of Asclepius, god of healing, stood on hills where the air was pure and the springs ran cold. Pilgrims came from distant lands, sleeping in sacred halls beneath painted ceilings. At night, they waited for dreams. If Asclepius visited them, appearing as a gentle snake or a shining figure, they would wake cured, or at least believing so. Dreams, faith, and medicine were intertwined, and sometimes belief alone was enough to soothe the soul. In the city of Athens, the year was 430 BCE when the Great Plague came. The city was crowded behind its walls, besieged by Sparta, the summer heat thick and unmoving. No prayer could hold back the sickness that crept through the streets. Thucydides, the historian, survived it, barely. He wrote that men died like flies, that the temples overflowed with corpses, that even faith faltered before the stench of decay. But he also wrote something else, that after the fever passed, people lived differently. They no longer trusted the gods to protect them. They trusted only what they could see, measure, and reason. The age of inquiry had truly begun. Imagine the streets of Athens then, marble dust in sunlight, sandals striking stone. Everywhere, talk of the body. What is balance? What is health? Hippocrates, the physician from Kos, gave answers that would echo for millennia. He said the body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was their harmony, illness their discord. It was a poetic idea, part science, part metaphor, yet it guided medicine for nearly 2,000 years. When a man was melancholic, they said his black bile had risen. When fever burned bright, blood overflowed. And though they could not see microbes or cells, they saw truth in rhythm. The body as cosmos, ordered and divine. In the shade of olive trees, Hippocrates taught his students to listen, not just to the cough or the wound, but to the story behind it. He spoke softly. Wherever the art of medicine is loved, there is also a love of humanity. It was a simple creed, and it remains one still. Across the Aegean, in Delphi, another kind of healing unfolded. The oracle's temple smelled of laurel and smoke. Pilgrims descended the marble steps in silence, carrying offerings of honey and doves. They came seeking answers, not about the body, but about destiny. Was their suffering punishment, a warning, a sign? The priestess, seated above the fissure where the earth exhaled its vapors, spoke in fragments and riddles. To the sick, her words could mean either doom or deliverance. Sometimes the two were the same. For the Greeks, to be ill was to be human, fragile, mortal, but also capable of meaning. In their art, illness was not hidden. Vases show men lying on couches, attended by friends and wives. Sculptures of gods and athletes reveal veins, muscles, the tension of breath. They sought perfection, yes, but also vulnerability. To them, beauty was not the absence of weakness, but its transformation into balance. The philosophers carried this further. Aristotle wrote that health was the natural state toward which all living things strive. Harmony between purpose and form. Plato spoke of the physician's duty as moral as well as physical. Even Socrates, before his death, drank poison with calm acceptance, turning illness into philosophy. The body, they believed, was not an enemy, but a mirror. Whatever plagued it also plagued the soul. And yet, for all their wisdom, fear never vanished. When plague swept again through Greek ports, the sick were carried to the temples, laid beneath frescoes of gods who had once walked the earth. Families left bread and figs, hoping to buy time. The smell of oil and myrtle filled the air. Outside, the sea shimmered indifferently, a reminder that life continued, always. At night, the healers walked the colonnades, their sandals whispering against stone. They spoke quietly about the day's cases, about balance and imbalance, about men who lived and those who did not. Above them, the stars wheeled slowly, ancient and patient. The same constellations that had watched the plagues of Egypt and Babylon now watched Athens. And still, the human story repeated itself: grief, endurance, renewal. The Greek word for medicine, pharmakon, meant both remedy and poison. It was a word of paradox, born of understanding that every cure carried risk, every act of healing a touch of danger. In that duality, the Greeks glimpsed something profound, that the line between life and death was not a wall, but a thread, fine as silk and trembling in the wind. When dawn rose over the Aegean, the city glowed pale and still. On the steps of the temple, a young physician washed his hands in cool water, the ripples catching the first light. He looked out toward the sea, perhaps thinking of all those who had come before, the priests of Egypt, the healers of Babylon, the nameless ones who sang to the stars. Each had faced the same mystery, the same silence that illness brings. And though their answers differed, their question never changed. How do we keep living, knowing how easily life can be lost? The waves answered softly against the stone, and the morning wind carried the scent of thyme and salt. Somewhere in the city, a bell tolled. The day and the search for healing began again. Empire of fever, Rome, and the Antonine plague. The empire was at its height. From the misty hills of Britannia to the burning sands of Syria, the Roman eagle cast its shadow over half the world. Roads stretched like veins through every province. Merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims flowed along them, carrying goods, stories, and unseen, the seeds of death. Wherever Rome went, the world grew connected, and wherever the world connected, disease found new paths. In the 2nd century after Christ, under the rule of Marcus Aurelius, the first great pandemic of the classical world began. It came quietly, as most do, whispered in the dust of returning legions. They had marched east to Parthia, victorious but weary, and among their spoils was something no one could see. The soldiers coughed, burned with fever, and died in their tents. When they came home, they brought the plague to the empire itself. At first, Rome tried to ignore it. The markets stayed open, the baths steamed as always, the amphitheaters roared with games. But soon the crowds thinned, merchants vanished from stalls, temples overflowed with offerings and prayers, yet the gods remained silent. The air itself seemed sick, heavy, still, waiting. Galen, the physician whose writings would shape medicine for centuries, was there. He described fevers that rose like fire, rashes like spilled wine, and breath that rattled like broken reeds. He called it pestis, the pestilence. Modern scholars think it was smallpox. Whatever it was, it left no house untouched. At its height, they said 5 million souls were taken. Soldiers, senators, slaves, emperors alike. No wall, no coin, no rank could protect them. Imagine the streets of Rome then, marble facades stained with soot, fountains still running, though no one stopped to drink. In the narrow alleys, the scent of smoke mixed with decay. Priests walked barefoot, sprinkling holy water on doorways marked with ash. The great baths stood empty, the laughter of citizens replaced by the coughs of the dying. Even the Tiber flowed quietly, as if in mourning. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, wrote his meditations during those years. He spoke of duty, mortality, and acceptance. "Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years, he wrote. He understood what so many rulers did not, that empire was an illusion of permanence. The plague had stripped Rome of its certainty. It had shown that the human body, however disciplined, was still clay before the wind. Across the empire, soldiers deserted. Fields went untilled, harvests rotted, and in far provinces silence spread faster than orders. The empire, stretched too far, began to tremble. For every cart of grain or amphora of wine, there were now 10 coffins. In the cities, fires burned night and day, not for warmth, but for cleansing. The people believed that smoke could drive away the fever. The skies above the Forum darkened with it, a haze that dimmed even the noon sun. And yet, amid the fear, there were moments of mercy. Neighbors cared for one another, even at risk of contagion. Nurses, many of them slaves, became silent heroes. They washed bodies, prepared the dead, and often joined them soon after. In the writings of the Stoics, one can still feel that quiet resilience, the belief that even in suffering, there is virtue, that to endure with grace is a form of wisdom. The plague did more than empty streets. It changed how Rome saw itself. Temples once filled with pride began to fill with humility. Old gods lost their power. New faiths began to whisper through the cracks. In the catacombs beneath the city, Early Christians tended to the sick, burying those no one else would touch. They spoke of compassion, resurrection, and an afterlife where suffering ended. For many, that promise was stronger than any empire. Imagine a Roman villa at dusk. The sky burns orange over the vineyards, but the household is silent. A mother kneels beside a bed, pressing a damp cloth to her child's forehead. Outside, a servant burns herbs, rosemary, laurel, sage, the smoke curling through the open window. Far away, in the city, the bells of the temples toll. Every sound feels distant, every breath sacred. In that moment, power means nothing. Only tenderness remains. When the fever finally waned, Rome was changed. The population had fallen, the army weakened, and faith itself reshaped. Galen continued to write about wounds, humors, and the mysteries of the heart. His books would travel farther than the empire that birthed them, surviving centuries after its fall. He believed, like Hippocrates before him, that the body was a balance of elements, that to heal was to restore harmony. But harmony, once lost, is not easily found again. The Antonine Plague was not Rome's last. A century later, the Cyprian Plague came, darker still. But the first had already taught the lesson that conquest cannot outpace contagion, that the map of disease ignores borders and crowns alike, and perhaps in some quiet way it humbled the world's greatest power, teaching it to kneel not before an army, but before the limits of flesh. At sunset, as the fires of purification faded, the empire seemed to exhale. The Tiber glowed red in the dying light, carrying ashes toward the sea. Somewhere on the Palatine Hill, a scribe dipped his pen and wrote the day's record. He did not know that centuries later, his ink would still whisper through the ages, that even in ruin, memory endures. And in that endurance lies Rome's truest monument, not marble nor empire, but survival, the shadow of faith. Plagues in the Byzantine world. The city glimmered like a crown between two seas. Its domes caught the morning sun, its walls gleamed with marble and gold, and its streets echoed with the steps of merchants, monks, and beggars alike. This was Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, a city of faith and splendor built upon the bones of Rome. But beneath its shining surface, the old rhythm of sickness still beat, waiting. It began, as such things often do, with whispers. A ship from Egypt, laden with grain, docked at the great harbor of Theodosius. The sailors coughed, a few collapsed. Soon after, rats slipped down the ropes into the city, their fur crawling with unseen passengers. Within days, the market smelled not of spice and oil, but of smoke and decay. The year was 541, the reign of Emperor Justinian, and the plague that bore his name had arrived. In the beginning, people did not understand. They thought it a fever, a passing sickness. The priests prayed, the physicians bled the sick, and life continued. But then the bodies began to swell, buboes rising beneath arms and between legs, blackened and burning. The fever came fast, the end faster. By the time the bells tolled, there were no hands left to dig the graves. From the sea walls to the hippodrome, the city fell silent. Chariots stood abandoned, bakeries empty. Even the call to prayer was drowned by the sound of lamentation. Procopius, the historian, wrote that 10,000 died in a single day. He described carts piled high with corpses, priests chanting through tears, and streets too full of death to walk. No one was spared. Nobles and servants, monks and merchants, all equal before the unseen. Emperor Justinian himself fell ill. The palace darkened its windows. The people waited, certain that the end of the world had come. When he recovered, weak but alive, they called it divine mercy. Yet mercy felt distant. Half the city lay empty. The plague had consumed Constantinople's pulse, its laughter, its trade, its hope. Outside the walls the land withered, fields went unharvested, villages burned their dead in silence, and even the birds seemed to vanish. The empire's heart had stopped beating, and the silence spread outward like a shadow. From Alexandria to Antioch, from Athens to Carthage, ships carried the same invisible cargo. Wherever trade reached, the plague followed. It was the first pandemic in the modern sense, a sickness of the connected world. Inside the churches, the air hung thick with incense. Candles flickered, casting halos of trembling light across mosaics of saints and angels. People knelt on cold stone floors, whispering prayers until their voices cracked. Faith was both refuge and torment. If the world was ruled by God, why did he permit such ruin? Monks spoke of apocalypse, of divine punishment for pride. Others whispered that demons walked among the corpses, feasting on fear. Yet even as despair grew, so too did devotion. The faithful carried icons through the streets, their painted eyes shining through smoke. They sang hymns to the Virgin, begging her to intercede. When the plague reached its height, some believed they saw miracles, a fever fading after prayer, a family spared when others fell. Perhaps those were coincidences, but in the silence of loss, even coincidence felt holy. In the palace, the Empress Theodora wept for the dead and commanded the building of new hospitals. Doctors, Aya Troy, were summoned from distant lands, their knowledge blending Greek reason with Persian remedies. They boiled vinegar, burned sulfur, and wore linen soaked in oils. None of it worked. Still, they tried. And in that effort, there was courage, the will to face what could not be conquered. Outside the city, along the shores of the Bosporus, the smoke of funeral pyres rose like fog. At night, it merged with the sea mist, turning the stars dim and red. Fishermen said the air itself was cursed, heavy, sweet, and strange. The people began to bury their dead at sea, dropping bodies weighted with stone into the dark water. They believed the current would carry the sickness away. But even the waves could not cleanse what was already within them. Imagine walking through that city, the scent of salt and smoke, the faint hum of prayer beneath the tolling of distant bells. You pass closed shutters, empty fountains, streets where only dogs move. In the distance, a church door stands open, and inside, light. A priest sings softly, his voice trembling but steady. You stand in the doorway, not believing, not disbelieving, only listening, because even now, in ruin, beauty lingers. When at last the fever receded, the empire was changed. A third of its people were gone. The fields of Anatolia lay fallow, the armies thinned, the treasuries hollow. For a moment, the Byzantines thought the world itself might end, but it did not. It endured, scarred and smaller, its faith tempered like iron in flame. In the centuries that followed, the plague returned again and again, rippling through generations. Each time, the people met it with the same mix of fear and devotion, closing their gates, lighting their candles, praying to be spared. And each time, they learned the same lesson, that no empire, no faith, no gold could make the body immortal. But perhaps something else endured, a deeper humility, the understanding that life, however fragile, is sacred precisely because it ends. As the mists of evening rolled over the city, the great dome of Hagia Sophia caught the last glint of the setting sun. Inside, the faint voices of monks rose in chant, echoing through marble and mosaic. Their song was neither victory nor defeat, only remembrance. And beyond the walls, the Bosporus breathed, eternal and calm, carrying with it the faint shadow of faith and the memory of all who had prayed beneath it. Candles and corpses, the Black Death arrives. The century opened with frost and hunger. Crops failed, rivers froze, and wolves prowled the edges of villages. The people of Europe prayed for deliverance, and when it came, it was not mercy, but plague. The year was 1347 when a ship from the east anchored in the Sicilian port of Messina. Its sails hung limp, its deck eerily still. When the dock workers boarded, they found the crew already dead, their skin darkened with swollen sores. Before anyone could flee, the rats had already begun their work. From that single harbor, the Black Death spread like smoke on the wind. By the following year, it had reached Italy, France, and England. By the third, it had consumed most of Europe. It did not march like an army. It drifted, unseen, along the roads, the rivers, and the breath of men. It came with traders, pilgrims, and soldiers. It came with prayers whispered too late. In the towns, bells tolled without end. Every ring marked another passing, until the sound itself became unbearable. Priests carried crosses through the streets, their robes stained with ash and wax. Behind them came the dead, cart upon cart, creaking through the narrow lanes. "Bring out your dead," the cry went up each morning, but by noon there was no one left to answer. Imagine the air thick with the scent of decay and candle smoke. Windows shuttered, doors barred. The streets were lined with candles, not for light, but for warning. Each flame marked a house of sickness. Inside, a family waited, counting the hours by the slow burn of wax. The flicker of those candles was the only movement left in the world. The physicians wore long robes of waxed cloth, gloves of leather, and masks shaped like birds. Inside the beaks, they placed herbs, lavender, myrrh, mint, believing the scent would purify the air. They carried canes to keep distance from the dying, and yet the dying reached for them anyway. No mask could keep out grief. They wrote of buboes swelling like eggs beneath the skin, of bleeding from the mouth and eyes, of a death so fast that one could dine with a friend and bury him by evening. Even they, the learned men, could do nothing. In monasteries, monks wrote by candlelight, their hands trembling as the fever spread through their brethren. They copied prayers onto parchment, ink blotted by tears. Some believed it was the end of days, the wrath of God made visible. Others said it came from the stars or from the corruption of air. And so they burned incense, rang bells, and filled the sky with smoke, the only defense they knew. But the plague did not care for rank or piety. It took kings and peasants alike. In Paris, the royal physicians fled. In London, the courts closed, and the streets became graveyards. Whole villages vanished, their fields overtaken by grass. The birds grew quiet, the mills stopped turning, and time itself seemed to hesitate. Yet even in that darkness, there were sparks of humanity. Neighbors left bread at doorsteps, risking their lives for strangers. Priests buried the dead by night, singing softly so the souls would not feel alone. Mothers held their children until the last breath, refusing to let go. It is always like this in history. The worst times reveal the best of what we are. In Florence, a young writer named Boccaccio lived through the terror. He described streets filled with corpses, families abandoning each other, and yet, amid it all, moments of laughter and survival. He would later write the Decameron, stories told by 10 people hiding from the plague in a villa outside the city. They told tales to distract themselves from death, to remind themselves of life. In those stories, you can still hear the sound of human resilience, fragile, trembling, but unbroken. The plague carried fear deeper than any sword could. It changed the way people thought about life and heaven. Churches overflowed with candles, but prayers grew hollow. Many began to question why the faithful suffered alongside the wicked. Faith fractured, and from that fracture would later emerge something vast, a new way of seeing the world, one that would give birth to the Renaissance. But in the 1340s, no one could yet imagine rebirth, only the endless night. In some towns, the desperate turned upon themselves. They blamed foreigners, beggars, and even their neighbors. In many cities, Jewish communities were massacred, accused of poisoning wells. It was fear, raw and blind, trying to find a face to punish. The plague was cruel enough, but what it revealed in humanity was crueler still. Across the countryside, The living built pits for the dead. Priests stood ankle-deep in graves, sprinkling holy water over hundreds of bodies at once. When they could not keep up, they stopped counting, and in that silence, Europe began to change. Laborers became scarce. The survivors found power in their scarcity. The feudal order cracked, slowly but surely, beneath the weight of death. From ruin, a strange, new freedom began to stir. Imagine walking through a village after the plague has passed. Grass grows between the cobbles. The wind moves through empty houses. A single candle still burns in a window, its wax long melted, its flame stubbornly small. You can almost hear the voices that once filled these rooms. Laughter, prayer, argument, song. Now only the echo remains. And yet, the fields beyond are greening again. The air smells of rain and earth, clean and cold. Life, impossibly, begins again. By the time the Black Death's first wave ended, it had taken perhaps a third of the world's people. But the story did not end there. The plague returned, again and again, for centuries. Each time it left scars in the body, in the faith, in the mind. And each time the survivors rebuilt, carrying with them a quiet knowledge that existence is both fragile and miraculous. The candles burned out, the carts stopped rolling, the bells fell silent, and in that silence the human heart began to beat once more, slower, wiser, and still afraid, yet ready to hope. The village that waited, isolation and survival. The world had gone quiet. After the first great wave of plague, towns stood hollow, and roads lay empty, but for the crows. The bells that once marked weddings and festivals now rang only for funerals, and then not at all. Across Europe, fear moved faster than trade, faster than faith. And in that fear, villages learned a new way to live, apart. It began with whispers, a traveler at the edge of town, coughing, a merchant caravan arriving with foreign cloth, a child fevered after touching a stranger's coin. Soon, the gates closed, ropes stretched across lanes, and guards refused entry, even to friends. Isolation, once unthinkable, became survival. To keep others out was to keep death away. In the English hills, in a small place called Ayam, the story was written most clearly. It was 1665, centuries after the first Black Death, yet the shadow had returned. A bolt of cloth from London brought the plague to the village. Within days, people began to die. The rector, William Mompesson, gathered his frightened flock and asked them for something extraordinary. To stay, not to flee, not to scatter the sickness through the countryside, but to remain where they were, to become their own living tomb. And they agreed. They drew a circle of stones around their village, a mile wide. No one crossed it, in or out. Families buried their dead in gardens and fields. Neighbors left food at the boundary in exchange for coins soaked in vinegar. They waved from a distance, faces pale beneath the summer sun, and went home to wait. Imagine it, the silence of isolation, broken only by birds and wind, children playing alone in empty lanes, a mother singing softly while her husband coughs beside her. The smell of herbs burned at doorways, the shimmer of candlelight through shutter cracks. It was a peace built on fear, and yet, in that stillness, there was also courage. The courage to endure not just death, but waiting. Weeks turned to months. The churchyard filled. In some houses, only one voice remained, and even that soon faded. But the vow held. No one fled. When the plague finally left, the surrounding villages found Ayam decimated, yet its neighbors untouched. Through sacrifice, they had stopped the spread. And though they did not call it by that name, it was the first act of quarantine in modern Europe. Elsewhere, similar acts unfolded quietly. In Italian hill towns, city gates were sealed. The watchmen shouted warnings from towers. The sick were tended from a distance. In mountain monasteries, monks closed their doors, writing prayers in isolation, the smell of ink and candle wax thick in the air. In ports along the Adriatic, ships arriving from the east were kept offshore for 40 days, 40 giorni, the origin of the word quarantine. 40 days of wind, hunger, and uncertainty, while sailors stared at the shore they could not touch. The people of that age did not understand contagion as we do. They thought the air itself could turn foul. Miasma, they called it. They believed plague rode on scent, on fog, on the breath of night. And so they filled their homes with flowers, burned herbs, and hung rosemary in doorways. They washed with vinegar, prayed over salt water, and carried little bags of crushed mint around their necks. They were wrong in their reasoning, yet right in their instinct, to separate, to cleanse, to wait. There is something hauntingly familiar in their patience. The idea that safety lies not in action, but in stillness. In those quiet months, entire generations learn to listen, to the ticking of the hours, to the sigh of wind through trees, to the slow rhythm of their own hearts. They learned that survival was not always heroic. Sometimes it was simply the act of remaining. In letters from that time, one reads of small joys that survived amid sorrow. A family baking bread together when grain ran low. Children carving toys from wood to pass the endless days. Neighbors calling to one another across fields, their voices drifting over the hedges like birdsong. Life did not end. It changed shape. It became smaller, slower, closer to the earth. When the plague ebbed, those who emerged were different, their faces lined, their eyes cautious, but their sense of connection deeper than before. They had learned that to be apart was also to belong, that their solitude had meaning because it protected others. In every village that waited, humanity had taken a quiet step toward compassion. Imagine the morning after. The doors open one by one. The sun pours through windows long shuttered. Children step out barefoot into grass heavy with dew. The smell of smoke lingers, but the air feels new. They listen to birds, to bells, to the hum of life returning. It is a fragile joy, the kind that trembles as it breathes, unsure whether to laugh or weep. The story of the villages that waited is not about triumph. It is about endurance. It is about the long, slow act of choosing care over fear, of living not for oneself, but for others unseen. Their names are forgotten, their graves unmarked, but their patience changed the course of time, because from their stillness came understanding, and from understanding came the first faint promise of a world that might someday heal. Masks of Venice, the birth of modern medicine. The sea glittered at dawn, and the city seemed to float upon it, a labyrinth of bridges, bells, and sighs. Venice, queen of the Adriatic, was a city of trade, of music, of light. It was also for centuries a city of plague. The very wealth that filled its palaces carried death through its ports. Every silk bundle, every barrel of spice, every letter from afar, all could hide a silent passenger. By the 14th century, Venetians had learned what others had only begun to guess. Sickness traveled with movement, and so they built their walls not of stone, but of time. Ships arriving from distant lands were made to wait, 40 days anchored beyond the lagoon. 40 giorni. 40 days became quarantine. The word itself was born here, upon this shifting water. Out on the island of Lazaretto Vecchio, just beyond the city's edge, the sick were taken by boat. They lay in long halls beneath vaulted ceilings, their moans mingling with the slap of waves. Monks moved among them in silence, faces hidden by cloth, hands wrapped in linen. The air smelled of vinegar and salt, and the sea breeze carried both comfort and sorrow. At night, the lanterns of the lagoon flickered through the mist, tiny lights over a city holding its breath. Venice survived by ritual. Every spring, the Doge himself would board the state galley and sail toward the open sea. There, he dropped a golden ring into the waves, symbolizing marriage between the city and the waters that sustained it. But behind the ceremony lay fear of the invisible tide that could return at any time. not from the sea's surface, but from its ships. Trade was life, yet trade was danger, and so the city learned to balance on the knife edge between prosperity and plague. The physicians of Venice wore masks shaped like birds, their long beaks filled with herbs and sponges soaked in perfume. The scent of rosemary, mint, and camphor followed them through the streets. They believed the plague spread through foul air, and that the sweet smells would shield them. In their gloved hands they carried canes, not to strike, but to measure distance. The image endures still, the masked doctor in the mist, half angel, half omen, terrifying and tender, a symbol of both science and superstition. But beneath the fear, something was changing. The healers began to observe. They recorded who fell sick and who survived. They noticed that those who had already been ill rarely caught the disease again. They counted, compared, questioned. The work was quiet, methodical, revolutionary. In the flicker of a candle, among ledgers and ink, medicine began to step away from magic. The Venetian Republic created laws of health, magistrati alla sanità, officials whose duty was to protect the city from contagion. They inspected markets, burned infected goods, and maintained the quarantine islands. For the first time, public health was not only a priestly act, but a civic one. Disease was no longer purely divine punishment. It was a problem of management, of reason. And with that realization, humanity took another step toward the modern world. Imagine walking along the canals at dusk. The air smells of salt and smoke. Behind closed shutters, families pray. A gondola glides past, carrying the dead to the island of San Michele, where bells toll softly across the water. The sound echoes against stone and sea alike, a low hum of mourning that feels almost like music. Above, the stars flicker faintly, distant candles of another kind. The plague doctors became both feared and revered. Children whispered when they passed. The sight of the long beak meant danger had arrived. Yet these masked figures also represented hope. They stood where others would not, touched what others dared not touch. In the records of the time, one can sense their weariness. Notes scribbled in margins, prayers pressed between pages, small drawings of crosses beside the names of those lost. They were not saviors, but they were witnesses. Venice itself became a laboratory. Here, the lines between medicine, law, and faith blurred. The Senate debated health measures with the same seriousness as war. Merchants funded hospitals, not only from charity, but from fear of economic collapse. The city, that once sang of love and beauty, had turned its genius toward survival, and in doing so, it created the first public health system in Europe. Across the sea, other cities began to imitate her. Ragusa, Dubrovnik, and Genoa built their own lazaretti. Every port learned to watch, to wait, to measure. Even when the plague receded, the habit of vigilance remained. Venice had shown that reason could coexist with reverence, that humanity could protect itself without abandoning belief. Inside the Doge's palace, beneath painted ceilings and golden lions, clerks compiled lists: who had died, who had recovered, which households remained untouched. Each record was a small defiance against chaos. To write was to resist forgetting. And through those inked names, we can still feel the pulse of a city trying to understand what it means to survive. When at last the bells stopped tolling, Venice returned to its shimmer. Music in the squares, laughter in the markets, gondolas drifting under bridges of marble. But the city was changed. Its people had seen death so close that life itself became a kind of devotion. Every mosque, every candle, every law written in the Senate chambers was part of the same prayer: may it not return. As dawn rose over the lagoon, the fog began to lift. The golden domes reflected the first light, and somewhere a single gull cried out. The city stirred, fragile yet unbroken, a mirror of humanity itself. And though the plague would come again and again, something new now flowed beneath the surface: understanding, a quiet conviction that knowledge, not fear, would one day lead us out of the mist, the fevered new world, smallpox, and empire. The ocean shimmered like glass beneath the sails. For months, the wind had carried ships westward, caravels heavy with faith, gold, and hunger. When they reached the shores of the Americas, they brought with them the cross, the sword, and disease. Invisible, uninvited, unstoppable, it moved faster than any army and did what no weapon could. It erased entire worlds. The first to arrive thought the land eternal. Mountains taller than any cathedral, forests without end, rivers wide as dreams. They called it a new world, but it was old, filled with civilizations as ancient and intricate as their own. In the temples of the Aztec, in the palaces of the Inca, in the stone cities of the Maya, life pulsed with rhythm and order. But within months of contact, the rhythm faltered. It began with fever, blisters on the skin, breath gone short. Whole villages woke coughing, trembling, burning. Those who survived the first night rarely saw another. The people called it Huezahuatl, the great rash. To the invaders, it was smallpox, a disease long known in Europe, carried in their blood as quietly as language. But to those who had never met it, it was a fire that devoured nations. In Mexico, when the Spanish entered Tenochtitlan, the great city glittered with canals and markets, more beautiful than any in Europe. Within a year, it was silent. The chronicler Bernardino de Sahagún wrote of people covered in sores, unable to move or speak. The priests could not bury the dead fast enough, the streets filled with dogs, the temples with smoke. When the Aztec emperor Cuitlahuac died, his people believed the gods had turned their faces away. In truth, it was not divine punishment, but biology, the smallest of invaders toppling the mightiest of empires. In the Andes, the Inca suffered the same fate. Before the Spanish even arrived, smallpox had already spread south from Panama, traveling along trade routes faster than horses could ride. By the time Pizarro reached the highlands, the disease had done his work for him. The emperor Huayna Capac was dead, his heirs divided, his people in mourning. The invaders found not resistance, but ruin. Imagine the sound of it, the silence of abandoned cities, the cough echoing through stone corridors. Clay idols left half-finished, looms still threaded with cloth, fires gone cold. The conquerors walked through ghosts, their own lungs full of breath that carried death to everything they touched. Some wept for what they saw, most did not. History has always moved at the pace of indifference. The smallpox virus traveled with the colonists, and behind it came others: measles, influenza, typhus. Together, they swept through the Americas like a tide, reducing populations by more than 90% within a century. In that single silence, entire languages vanished, gods faded, songs went unsung. And yet, even in devastation, life found ways to endure. The survivors adapted. They buried the dead in secret, fled into forests and mountains, or sought meaning in the faith of those who had destroyed them. In this mingling of sorrow and survival, new worlds began to form. Mestizo cultures, blended prayers, hybrid remedies. Herbal knowledge of the Americas met European medicine. From native healers came quinine, tobacco, and countless plants that would one day save lives far away. The exchange was not only of death, but of knowledge, a tragic symmetry. On the islands of the Caribbean, enslaved Africans brought by the same ships carried both memory and immunity. They too had known smallpox. And within their suffering lay a paradox. They sometimes survived where others did not. From that grim advantage, entire economies of cruelty arose. Empires measured their wealth not in gold, but in bodies, human and otherwise. The fever of conquest burned hotter than the fevers it unleashed. In the colonies, Fear of disease shaped everything. The Spanish built hospitals called lazaretos, echoing those of Venice. They burned incense, carried relics, and prayed to saints like San Roque, patron of plague victims. In time, local saints arose, those who had died caring for the sick, now immortalized in paint and legend. The Americas became a vast cathedral of mourning, every chapel a testament to loss. But even the invaders were not spared. Smallpox did not distinguish conqueror from conquered. In the sweltering ports of Havana, Cartagena, and Veracruz, sailors fell as quickly as the native peoples they feared. The disease was impartial, a great leveler disguised in rashes and fire. And yet, amid the ruin, whispers of understanding grew. European physicians began to suspect immunity, that those who had survived once could not be struck again. They wrote of it cautiously, not yet knowing why. But this idea, born in the ashes of empire, would one day give rise to one of humanity's greatest defenses. Imagine the scene: a ship anchored off the coast of Hispaniola, the sea calm, the sky wide and merciless. On deck, a young surgeon studies his patients, marking their scars with a quill. He does not yet know that the small marks of survival will hold the key to prevention, for now he only knows the smell of salt, sweat, and sickness, the endless rhythm of death and departure. By the late 1600s, smallpox had crossed back across the ocean again, moving now from colony to continent. It became a disease of both worlds, binding them together in misery and dependence. But it also began to teach something profound, that sickness, like empire, could be studied, mapped, and perhaps one day defeated. At sunset, the wind carries the scent of smoke from distant fires, villages burning their dead, ships fumigating their holds. The horizon glows red, neither dusk nor dawn, only the color of endurance. And as night falls over the new world, the sea itself seems to whisper that no empire lasts forever, but memory does. Sailors of sickness, trade routes and cholera. The century opened with motion, ships cut through the waves with iron hulls and clouds of steam. Trains roared across continents that had once taken months to cross. The world was shrinking, its borders dissolving under trade, telegraph, and empire. But the faster humanity moved, the faster its diseases followed, and none traveled farther or struck with more sudden cruelty than cholera. It began quietly along the warm rivers of Bengal, there in the shallow waters where people bathed, washed, and drank, an unseen organism waited. Vibrio cholerae, a tiny spiral of life that could bring death in a single day. The locals had known it for centuries, calling it the blue sickness, for it left the skin cold and pale. But in the 1800s, as ships carried soldiers, merchants, and pilgrims across the seas, cholera escaped the delta and entered the bloodstream of the world. By 1817, it had reached Calcutta, and from there, the ships carried it west, first to the Middle East, then to Russia, then to Europe itself. In every port it touched, the same pattern unfolded: sudden vomiting, endless thirst, then collapse. The afflicted died so quickly that the living barely had time to mourn. In London, Paris, and Hamburg, the smell of lime and smoke filled the air as the authorities tried to cleanse the streets. Doctors wore long coats and carried vinegar-soaked cloths. The newspapers called it the Asiatic pestilence. To the poor, it was simply terror without reason. Imagine a London street in 1832, the fog heavy, the gutters overflowing with sewage and rain, children barefoot, women carrying water from the same pump that sickened them. In tenements of brick and shadow, the disease moved faster than footsteps. Whole families vanished between dawn and dusk. The rich fled to the countryside. The poor were left to die in the stench of the city. The river Thames, glittering by day, reeking by night, carried both trade and death. In that chaos, a few began to ask questions. Among them, was a quiet English physician named John Snow. He did not believe the disease came from bad air, as most still thought. He believed it traveled through water, unseen, yet traceable. When another outbreak struck London in 1854, Snow walked the streets of Soho with a notebook, marking every death. He found the pattern led to one place, the pump on Broad Street. When the handle was removed, the outbreak subsided. It was not a miracle, but evidence, the birth of epidemiology, the science of tracing disease through reason, not ritual. Elsewhere, cities began to change. Sewers were built, streets widened, wells cleaned. Governments established health boards, public inspectors, and quarantine rules. Out of the filth of cholera, the modern city was born, not by design, but by necessity. The disease had revealed what comfort had concealed, that the health of one depended on the health of all. In India, where it began, cholera never left. It lingered in the rivers and monsoons, flaring with each season. British soldiers carried it along the railways, spreading it faster than it could be understood. For the empire, it was an inconvenience. For the people who lived within it, an inheritance of suffering. Even pilgrims on the sacred journey to Mecca carried it across oceans. The disease became a companion of faith, a reminder that no road, however holy, was safe from the world's smallest travelers. By the late 19th century, cholera had circled the globe 7 times. Each pandemic began the same way: a rumor in a port city, a ship quarantined too late, a child fevered on the riverbank. Governments blamed foreigners, the poor, the unclean, anyone but themselves. But the truth was simpler. Humanity had become one body, and the sickness of one limb could reach all others. Imagine a sailor standing on the deck of a ship in 1865, the air thick with salt and humidity. Below deck, the crew coughs weakly, the barrels of water slosh, already fouled. He looks toward the horizon, hoping for land, knowing that even if they reach it, the port may refuse them. The sun sinks, the sea glows copper, and somewhere in the hold, another cough falls silent. It is a small, terrible sound, the world learning what connection truly costs. And yet, cholera also taught endurance. It forced nations to cooperate, to share knowledge across borders. The first international sanitary conferences were held in the 1850s, bringing doctors and diplomats together not for conquest but for survival. Slowly, the idea of global health took shape, fragile, imperfect, but real. The disease that had traveled the world had also, in a strange way, united it. By century's end, the German scientist Robert Koch had seen the culprit through his microscope, the tiny curved bacterium that twisted like a thread of light. For the first time, the enemy had a face, and with it, hope began to take form. Vaccines were still distant, but understanding had arrived. It was no longer the gods or the air. It was something that could be studied, contained, even defeated. As night falls over the harbor, lanterns flicker on the ships, their reflections trembling in the black water. The gulls cry above the masts, and somewhere a bell tolls, not for death, but for departure. The sailors prepare to cast off, their cargo uncertain, their faith thin but enduring. The sea waits, as it always has, to carry both life and loss to distant shores, and in that shimmering wake the world moves on, smaller, wiser, forever bound by the same invisible tide. The great influenza, a world in mourning. The guns of the First World War had barely fallen silent when another sound took their place. The coughing of millions. The world, exhausted and broken, was about to face an enemy it could neither see nor shoot. It began in the spring of 1918 in military camps crowded with young men who had already survived the trenches. By autumn, it had spread to every continent. They called it influenza, but history would rename it the Spanish flu. It killed more people in a single year than the war had in 4. At first, it seemed ordinary, a fever, a sore throat, fatigue. Then came the second wave, and the world changed. The cough deepened, faces turned blue from lack of air. Young adults, the strong and healthy, fell fastest. Doctors were helpless. Hospitals overflowed, and when no beds remained, they filled the corridors, the churches, the schools. Every city sounded the same. The creak of carts carrying the dead, the distant toll of bells, the muffled sob of a world too tired to cry. Imagine a street in Philadelphia in October 1918. The air sharp with autumn, the sidewalks littered with straw meant to soak up blood and spit. A parade had been held just days before, tens of thousands gathering to celebrate the end of war. Within a week, the hospitals were full, bodies piled in the morgues. The nurses, mostly women who had once sewn bandages for soldiers, now fought to keep civilians alive. They wore gauze masks and carried bottles of disinfectant, though neither could truly protect them. In the newspapers, officials insisted there was nothing to fear. Factories stayed open, the trains kept running. But by winter, the fear could no longer be hidden. Entire towns closed their doors. Signs appeared on every house: no visitors, do not enter. In some cities, even funerals were banned. The dead were wrapped in sheets and buried without ceremony, sometimes at night, sometimes by strangers. The world had grown silent again, not from reverence, but exhaustion. In America alone, an estimated 675,000 died. Across the globe, perhaps 50 million. The disease reached the Arctic and the Pacific Islands, the deserts of Africa, the monasteries of Tibet. There was nowhere it did not touch. Its reach was total, its indifference absolute. Doctors compared it to a fire that needed no fuel, burning through humanity itself. And yet, amid the devastation, there were glimpses of something tender. Neighbors left food on porches. Nurses sang to patients too weak to speak. Children drew pictures of angels and taped them to windows. In villages across Europe and Asia, bells tolled for the lost, and prayers rose not for victory, but for rest. It was the first truly global mourning, the first time the whole world shared the same grief at once. In England, the poet Wilfred Owen had died in the final week of the war, his mother learning of it as church bells rang for peace. In the months that followed, it was not gunfire, but coughing that echoed through the streets. Humanity, still dressed for triumph, found itself instead in mourning clothes. The monuments of war were still unfinished when the graves of plague began to outnumber them. Medical understanding was still incomplete. No one knew the cause. Some thought it came from dust, from bad weather, from German laboratories. Masks were worn, then abandoned, then worn again. Every community made its own rules. Schools closed, then reopened too soon. It was a confusion that feels eerily familiar even now, the rhythm of panic and denial, of fatigue and fragile hope. In the chaos, quiet acts of discovery were taking place. Doctors began to study transmission, tracing outbreaks through troop movements, rail lines, and ports. They learned that the disease was viral, not bacterial, a revelation that would shape medicine for a century. The groundwork was being laid for something new, the study of virology, the birth of modern epidemiology, the dream of prevention. But for the living, science offered little comfort. In the absence of answers, they turned to ritual. In Mexico, families lit candles for the dead, blending ancient traditions with new losses. In Japan, monks chanted sutras through gauze masks. In Africa, people gathered outside their huts to sing softly to the spirits of the departed. Across the world, grief took on local colors, but the melody was the same, low, slow, endless. Imagine a hospital ward in the early dawn, rows of cots, white sheets, the faint smell of disinfectant and sweat. A nurse moves between beds, adjusting blankets, whispering comfort she no longer believes in. Through the window, The first light touches frost on the glass. She pauses, presses her hand to her own forehead, and for a moment wonders if she feels warm. The fear is quiet, steady, and shared by all. By the end of 1919, the fever had finally burned itself out. It left behind orphans, widows, and a silence that felt heavier than victory. When the world rebuilt, it did so slowly, cautiously, aware now that progress could be fragile, that modernity could be mortal. For a generation raised on war and science, the flu had taught a humbling truth, that even the future can bleed. In the years that followed, the influenza faded from memory, overshadowed by the war that framed it. But its mark endured, in medicine, in public health, in the whispered caution that always followed celebration. Every epidemic since would carry its ghost, and as the 1920s began, with jazz and motion and speed, the world danced again, not in ignorance, but in defiance. For beneath the glitter of a new age, grief still pulsed quietly, steady as a heartbeat, reminding those who survived that life, no matter how brief, must be lived fully. Invisible enemies, tuberculosis and the romantic soul, it did not strike like the plagues before it. There were no sudden fevers, no swollen buboes, no mass graves filled overnight. This illness came softly, like a whisper that never left the lungs. They called it consumption, the slow wasting away of the body, as though life itself was being gently inhaled by something unseen. For centuries, it was the most common cause of death in the civilized world, yet it wore the mask of melancholy rather than terror. In the 1800s, it seemed to touch everyone: poets, painters, seamstresses, and soldiers, rich and poor alike. It was a sickness that lingered in parlors and tenements, in the cough of a child, in the blush of a cheek too bright to be healthy. People spoke of it almost tenderly. They called it the White Plague, and for a strange, tragic time, it became entangled with beauty itself. In the Romantic era, tuberculosis shaped imagination. Its victims grew thin and pale, their eyes luminous, their voices soft. Writers described them as otherworldly, half in love with death. The poet John Keats, himself dying of the disease, wrote of being half in love with easeful death. His breath, heavy with blood and sweetness, filled his letters with longing and resignation. When he died at 25, he asked for no name on his tombstone, only the words, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." The world wept, not only for the man, but for the fragile beauty of his illness. In parlors across Europe, people spoke of consumption as though it were an artist's companion, a cruel muse that refined the soul even as it destroyed the flesh. Painters portrayed the sick as delicate and divine, their faces glowing with fever light. Opera heroines died beautifully upon stage, coughing into lace handkerchiefs. Even death itself was romanticized, softened by music and candlelight. But behind that poetry, the reality was far more brutal. Tuberculosis was a disease of breath, passed through air from one mouth to another. It thrived in crowded factories, in damp basements, in families too poor to open their windows. While the wealthy swooned in sanitized tragedy, the poor coughed blood onto rags. Children in industrial cities wasted away before adulthood. Hospitals overflowed with those too weak to stand. It was an invisible war, fought in whispers and wheezes, measured not in days but in years. Imagine the sound of it: a slow cough echoing in a quiet room, the creak of a bed, the faint scratching of pen on paper, the air heavy with the smell of disinfectant and wilted flowers. Outside, carriages roll through fog. Inside, time moves like smoke, curling, fading, lingering. This was the rhythm of the 19th century's greatest killer. And yet, in its shadow, science advanced. In 1882, a German doctor named Robert Koch announced that he had discovered the cause, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, a living organism that could be seen under the microscope. For the first time, the invisible enemy had a name. The discovery shattered the old myths of heredity and poetic illness. It was not destiny, it was infection, and infection could, someday, be defeated. Sanatoriums rose across Europe and America, vast buildings of stone and glass set high in the mountains, where air was thought to heal. Patients spent their days on balconies wrapped in blankets, breathing the cold. They were told to rest, to eat, to wait. Some improved, most did not. But there was solace in the routine, in the quiet camaraderie of those who knew their time was short. Nurses moved silently through the halls, their footsteps muffled on wooden floors. The sound of coughing echoed like distant thunder, constant, unending, strangely peaceful. In those mountain retreats, hope flickered. Doctors experimented with sunlight, diet, and rest. They began to understand that disease was not a punishment, but a process, something that could be studied, managed, even prevented. In their careful notes and patient records lay the first outlines of modern public health. Meanwhile, the image of the consumptive artist persisted. The composer Chopin coughed through his concerts, his hands trembling over the keys. The novelist Catherine Mansfield wrote of her illness as though describing a haunting. Even after science had unmasked the bacterium, culture could not let go of the metaphor. To waste away was to become translucent, spiritual, almost holy. The world was in love with its own fragility, but tuberculosis was not a muse. It was merciless. It hollowed out lungs, weakened bones, and left survivors frail and coughing for life. It killed quietly but steadily, shaping demography, economy, and emotion alike. Whole families vanished from city records, their deaths noted only by initials and numbers. The graves of consumptives formed long, even rows at the edges of cemeteries, where the wind always seemed to sigh. And yet, from the sorrow came compassion. The Red Cross expanded its reach. Doctors shared information across nations. Public health campaigns urged fresh air, clean housing, and hygiene. For the first time, governments began to understand that illness was not just an individual fate, but a social condition. Out of one disease, an entire philosophy of care began to grow. Imagine standing on a sanatorium terrace at dusk. The mountains fade into shadow, the air thin and sharp. Below, a patient's cough drifts upward, followed by a faint strain of music from a gramophone. Somewhere, a nurse pulls a blanket over a sleeping form. The world is quiet, suspended between suffering and serenity. This is the strange beauty of the age, the moment before science overtakes superstition, before light overtakes darkness. By the early 20th century, the first vaccines and treatments were beginning to appear. Slowly, painfully, tuberculosis began to retreat. But it never vanished. Even now, it lingers in parts of the world where poverty endures, a reminder that progress is uneven and mercy incomplete. Yet the dream born from its struggle, that disease can be understood, contained, and one day eradicated, remains. And so, the age of consumption faded, leaving behind its art, its sorrow, and its quiet legacy, the idea that science and humanity could stand side by side, hand in hand, against the invisible, miracle and machine. The birth of antibiotics, the century of light, had dawned. Cities hummed with electricity, engines purred, and humanity began to believe it had mastered the world. The old plagues, cholera, typhus, tuberculosis, still haunted memory, but they now seemed distant, like bad dreams fading at sunrise. Hospitals shone with polished metal and glass, white coats replaced priestly robes, and medicine spoke in the confident language of science. It was an age of hope, and its greatest miracle began by accident. In 1928, a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming returned from vacation to his laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital in London. On his workbench, he found a petri dish that had been left uncovered. A blue-green mold had grown upon it, and around the mold, the bacteria he had been studying had dissolved into clarity. Where others might have thrown it away, Fleming paused. He stared at the strange, clean circle, a tiny halo of death and salvation, and realized what it meant. The mold was Penicillium notatum, and it secreted something that killed bacteria. That something would soon be called penicillin. The discovery was quiet, almost humble, but within 2 decades it would change the course of human history more profoundly than any war. For the first time, there was a weapon not of faith or ritual, but of chemistry, a cure that worked not by luck, but by law. The age of antibiotics had begun. The early years were slow. Fleming's mold was fragile, difficult to cultivate. It took another generation of scientists, Howard Florey, Ernst Chain, and their team in Oxford, to turn the idea into medicine. They grew vats of the fungus, refined its extract, and tested it on dying soldiers. The results were astonishing. Infection that once meant certain death began to retreat. Wounds healed, fevers broke, bodies that had been given up for lost returned to life. It was as though the balance between humankind and its microbes had finally shifted. Then came the war, and with it, urgency. Factories that had once built engines now grew mold. Women in overalls tended trays of penicillium under warm lights, the air thick with the smell of fermentation. Every vial that left the production line carried a promise that soldiers might live to see home. By the time the Second World War ended, penicillin had saved millions. The newspapers called it the miracle drug. The world believed the age of sickness was ending. Imagine a hospital tent in 1944, rain beating softly against canvas. A young soldier lies pale and fevered, his wound dark with infection. A nurse injects a clear liquid into his arm, and within hours the fever falls. He sleeps. Outside, the guns still thunder, but inside the tent, for the first time in centuries, medicine feels like victory. After the war, antibiotics flooded the world. Factories expanded, laboratories multiplied, and new drugs followed: streptomycin, tetracycline, erythromycin. Each discovery widened the circle of protection. Diseases that had stalked humanity for millennia, pneumonia, scarlet fever, sepsis, began to vanish from the daily lexicon of fear. Children survived who would once have been lost. Hospitals became places of healing rather than waiting rooms for death. Life expectancy soared, and optimism bloomed like spring after a long, cold century. But even as the light grew, new shadows formed. The drugs that healed also invited overuse. Doctors prescribed them for every cough, every scratch. Farmers fed them to livestock to quicken growth. Bacteria, ancient and patient, began to adapt. One by one, strains emerged that no medicine could kill. The miracle had worked too well and too freely. Still, in the 1950s and 60s, few saw the danger. The age was too bright, too certain. Vaccines appeared for polio, diphtheria, and measles. Hospitals gleamed like temples of progress. In classrooms, children drew rockets beside red crosses, imagining a future where disease itself would be conquered, like space. The white-coated scientist became the new saint of the modern world, rational, calm, benevolent. In those same years, machines began to hum alongside medicine. X-rays peered through skin. Electrocardiographs traced the pulse of hearts. Hospitals filled with the sounds of beeping, whirring, breathing. The symphony of survival. For the first time, the human body seemed less mysterious, more manageable. We had entered the era of controlled life. Yet even as antibiotics reshaped the world, the memory of their origins remained strangely human. Fleming himself warned that misuse could undo everything. If you use penicillin recklessly, he said, You are morally responsible for the death of the man who succumbs to the resistant infection. His words, half prophecy, half plea, went largely unheard. In the flush of victory, humility was easy to forget. Imagine a pharmacist in the 1950s. Glass jars lined neatly on shelves, the scent of alcohol and chalk in the air. A mother enters, worried for her child's cough. The pharmacist measures the syrup carefully, his hands steady. Outside, the rain patters on the pavement, soft and constant. It feels like a civilized world, safe and modern. The plagues of the past seem distant now, like old myths fading into history books. But beneath the glass and order, the microbes still dream of a return. The age of antibiotics was not only a scientific revolution, it was a moral one. It changed how humanity thought about suffering, obligation, and mercy. To heal became a duty not of priests, but of societies. Hospitals became rights, not luxuries. Governments began to measure success not only by borders or industry, but by public health. In the sterile glow of laboratories, humanity found a strange kind of grace. By mid-century, the miracle had become routine. A pill for every pain, a promise for every wound. The old fear of contagion faded. People no longer whispered about death, they whispered about discovery. Science had become the new scripture, and though the prophets of the microscope could not foresee every consequence, they had given the world something rare, the belief that knowledge could heal. As the sun set on the century of cures, the white halls of hospitals glowed softly beneath fluorescent light. Machines breathed where bodies could not. Children played outside without fear of smallpox or scarlet fever. The air smelled of alcohol and clean linen. It was not perfection, but it was peace. And somewhere in that quiet peace, in a dish of forgotten mold, the story of suffering had turned a page. The viral age, from polio to AIDS. The century's heart beat faster now. Engines roared, cities glowed, and science seemed unstoppable. The great plagues of history had been tamed. Antibiotics, vaccines, and hospitals promised a new order of health. In white coats and bright laboratories, humanity stood triumphant. But viruses, those smallest, simplest forms of life, waited in the margins, patient and merciless. They reminded the modern world that mastery was not the same as immunity. Polio came first. It struck the young, paralyzing without warning. A child might go to bed healthy and wake unable to walk. For generations, summer carried fear. Swimming pools closed, mothers whispered, and wheelchairs filled the porches of hospitals. The iron lung became the symbol of this strange new terror. Vast metal cylinders that breathed for those who could not. Rows of children lay within them, their small faces reflected in steel. The sound of the machine's steady hiss was both lullaby and sentence. In the 1940s and 50s, the world turned to science for deliverance. Jonas Salk, a quiet American researcher, tested a vaccine made from killed viruses. He did not patent it. When asked who owned it, he replied, "Could you patent the sun?" By 1955, millions of children were vaccinated. The disease that had haunted playgrounds began to fade. In the decades that followed, another vaccine by Albert Sabin, taken on a sugar cube, carried the cure even further. By the dawn of the 21st century, polio was nearly gone, a ghost at the edge of memory. It had been conquered not by isolation or prayer, but by trust. Yet while one virus fell, another rose. In the 1980s, a new sickness began to whisper through cities. It was first noticed among young men, then among hemophiliacs, then newborns. It did not announce itself with rash or cough, but with absence, the quiet disappearance of the immune system. Doctors called it AIDS. At first, it was a mystery, then a panic, then a stigma that divided the world. Imagine a hospital ward in New York in 1983. Fluorescent lights hum overhead. Beds line the corridor. Young men with lesions on their skin lie motionless, their friends sitting beside them in silence. Nurses move quietly, some in gloves and masks, others without. They do not yet know how it spreads. They only know that those who catch it do not return. Outside, the newspapers scream. Fear turns to prejudice, compassion turns to shame. The virus, HIV, spread not through air or touch, but through intimacy and blood. Yet ignorance moved faster than truth. Families disowned their sons, hospitals refused patients, and funerals went unattended. Politicians spoke rarely. When they did, it was in the language of morality, not medicine. An epidemic of silence grew around the one in flesh, but within that silence, love endured. Communities organized, cared, and protested. They demanded research, recognition, dignity. In San Francisco, London, Paris, and Johannesburg, candlelight vigils filled the night, soft seas of flame flickering against the wind. Doctors and nurses, many themselves ostracized, held hands with the dying when no one else would. They learned again the oldest lesson, that healing is not only of the body. In 1984, the virus was identified. A year later, tests were developed. Soon came the first antiretroviral drugs. Imperfect, brutal, but a beginning. Patients who had expected to die began to live long enough to watch medicine catch up. The fight became global. By the 1990s, the epidemic had spread to every continent, especially devastating sub-Saharan Africa. In some villages, entire generations were lost. Grandmothers raised orphans, fields lay untended, and yet, even there, hope refused to die. Programs of education and prevention took root. The same world that had once ignored the crisis began, slowly, to respond. Meanwhile, the virologists, the new guardians of the invisible, turned their microscopes toward every threat. They studied influenza, measles, Ebola, the ever-changing mosaic of viral life. They learned that humanity and its microbes were not enemies in a war, but dancers in an ancient rhythm, one always leading, the other following. The viruses evolved, adapted, waited. Each pandemic was not an ending, but a reminder. In laboratories across the world, the dream of a universal vaccine took shape. Scientists mapped the genetic code, built machines that could read life itself. They froze samples of every known virus, both to study and to guard against the unknown. The work was meticulous, patient, endless, a kind of prayer made with microscopes instead of candles. But progress came with unease. Antibiotic resistance spread. Old diseases, malaria, dengue, measles, resurfaced in places thought safe. The balance between miracle and caution tilted once more. The world had conquered many plagues, but it had also created conditions, crowded cities, global travel, ecological strain, where new ones could flourish. Imagine a scientist late at night, alone, in a sterile room. The hum of freezers, the soft glow of computer screens. She looks through a microscope and sees something small and perfect, a virus suspended in glass, beautiful and terrible. It is neither good nor evil. It simply is. She adjusts the lens, her reflection merging with the unseen. For a moment, the boundary between humanity and its enemies feels paper-thin. By the end of the century, millions had died of AIDS, but millions more were living with it. Medicine had turned the plague into a condition, death into life prolonged. Polio had nearly vanished, smallpox entirely, and new vaccines were being born each year. The viral age had not ended, but humanity had learned to listen, to adapt, to fight without hatred. For every silence, there was a voice. For every loss, a vigil. For every sickness, a search. And so, beneath the hum of machines and the quiet of wards, the world continued, scarred, wiser, breathing. The ancient battle between life and its reflection carried on, as it always had, in the shared space between fear and faith, science, and love. Epidemics of fear, media, panic, and control. By the late 20th century, humanity had learned to read its own pulse. The microscope had revealed what faith once concealed. Satellites now mapped the spread of illness in real time. The world was faster, brighter, endlessly connected, but connection brought a new kind of contagion, not of the body, but of the mind. The next great pandemic would not only be carried by breath or blood, it would travel through language, through rumor, through the blue glow of the screen. The age of fear had begun. In the old days, disease moved with ships and caravans. Now it moved with headlines. A single cough in one country could shake markets and ocean away. Television anchors, once voices of authority, now spoke in tones of dread. Every outbreak became a spectacle, framed by urgency, narrated by panic. Fear became its own epidemic, spreading faster than infection, shaping behavior before the facts were known. It was not malicious, only human. Fear is how the body reacts to uncertainty. It tightens, prepares, protects. But in the modern world, uncertainty never ends. Every image of suffering loops endlessly. Every number updates in real time. The result is a global heartbeat too fast to rest, too loud to ignore. In 2003, when SARS, another coronavirus, appeared in China, the panic was immediate. Airports filled with masks, borders closed, cities emptied overnight. The outbreak killed fewer than 1,000, but it revealed something vast, that information could paralyze entire nations faster than infection could. Images of masked doctors and deserted streets lingered long after the virus was gone. People had tasted global anxiety and found it contagious. Imagine a newsroom late at night. Screens flicker with maps and charts, red dots blooming like fever across continents. Editors argue about wording. Outbreak or crisis, every headline must balance between truth and terror. Outside, rain falls on an empty city, and somewhere a family refreshes their phone for updates. No one knows whether they are reading safety or poison. Governments, too, learned the power of panic. They could calm it or use it. During the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa, isolation measures saved lives, but also bred mistrust. Foreign doctors in white suits looked like ghosts. Rumors spread that hospitals were harvesting organs, that medicine was a weapon. Fear, once again, became the deadliest contagion. In some villages, people hid their sick rather than report them, and so the disease multiplied. Meanwhile, far from the chaos, in the quiet rooms of the World Health Organization, maps and numbers filled screens. The world had built an infrastructure of awareness, surveillance, response, coordination, yet it still struggled against its oldest flaw, disbelief. Knowledge could be shared instantly, but trust could not. The more people knew, the less they seemed to believe. The rise of social media transformed fear into noise. Every rumor found an audience, every claim a witness. The digital age turned panic into performance, a chorus of worry, each voice amplifying the next. There was no longer a single narrative, no unified response, only a storm of opinion. And in that storm, the truth often drowned. But fear, like illness, has its uses. It motivates preparation, drives progress, forces adaptation. After each outbreak came reform. Better laboratories, stronger health systems, new vaccines. Each wave of anxiety carved lessons into the collective mind. Humanity learned, again and again, that fear can protect as much as it harms. Still, the toll was psychological. Children grew up in a world where masks and warnings were normal. Travelers eyed strangers with quiet suspicion. The ancient impulse to gather, to share breath and warmth, began to carry unease. Communion became risk, solitude, safety. The same species that had survived by closeness now feared its own proximity. Yet amid the noise, there were quiet acts of reason. doctors explaining calmly on television, scientists posting data openly online, neighbors sharing food during quarantine. Even in the maelstrom of misinformation, small truths held their ground. Fear was loud, but compassion, as always, was steady. Imagine standing in a subway car during a modern outbreak. Everyone wears a mask. No one speaks. The doors close. The train hums into darkness. Eyes meet briefly above the cloth. Suspicion first, then shared weariness. For all our technology, the moment is ancient. We have been here before, in every century, bound by breath, by worry, by hope. As governments drafted new health laws and media evolved new codes of caution, a strange realization took hold. That pandemics were not merely biological, but social events. They revealed what we trusted, who we listened to, what we feared most. They were mirrors, showing not the virus, but the human response to it. In that sense, the story of epidemics had come full circle. The ancient priest reading omens in smoke, the modern journalist watching graphs on a screen, both sought meaning in chaos. Both tried to explain the inexplicable. And though their languages were different, their emotions were the same. As the century turned, the world grew quiet for a while. Outbreaks came and went, avian flu, swine flu, Zika, each a rehearsal for something greater. The systems built by fear remained in place. Global alerts, emergency funds, vaccines on standby. The question was no longer if another pandemic would come, but when. And when it did, it would test not only our medicine, but our memory. In the hum of fluorescent offices, analysts watched the screens glow red and blue, knowing that every data point was a heartbeat. Fear would come again. It always does. But perhaps beneath the noise something stronger was forming. A quiet resilience, the collective memory of survival. For though fear spreads fast, courage spreads faster. And in the long, slow rhythm of human history, every epidemic of panic ends the same way, not with despair, but with endurance. Pandemic silence, COVID-19, and the empty world. It began, as it always does, with a whisper. A handful of cases in a city most had never heard of. A cough behind a closed door, a fever brushed off as ordinary. Then, like wind feeding fire, the whisper became a storm. By the time the world looked up, the invisible tide had already crossed every border. Airplanes grounded, streets emptied, voices retreated indoors. Humanity, so loud and restless for so long, fell into sudden stillness. The year was 2020, and the silence was global. The disease had a name, COVID-19, but in the beginning, names meant little. It was simply the virus, the thing that cancelled plans, closed schools, and turned faces into masks. In the great cities, sound vanished. No footsteps in the squares, no laughter in the cafes, only the hum of sirens and the faint cry of birds reclaiming the sky. Air that had been gray with exhaust turned blue again. From Delhi to Milan to Los Angeles, the horizon cleared, and for a brief, uneasy moment, the earth seemed to breathe without us. Inside, life grew smaller. People learned the geometry of confinement, the dimensions of a room, the rhythm of a day marked by screens, meals cooked slowly, letters written again, time stretched thin and strange. Neighbors waved from balconies, their voices echoing through empty courtyards. Across the planet, millions sat behind windows and watched the same sunset, separated by oceans but united in pause. The world had never been so distant, or so close. In hospitals, the silence was broken only by the sound of machines. Ventilators hissed softly, monitors blinked, gloves snapped against skin. Doctors worked until collapse, their faces bruised from masks, their eyes hollow behind fogged plastic. In their exhaustion, they became saints of the secular world, not mythic heroes, but ordinary humans holding back the tide. Outside, people clapped from balconies, a fragile music of gratitude carried through the night air. Fear returned, ancient and familiar. Supermarkets emptied, borders closed, Rumors spread faster than the disease itself. Some refused to believe, others believed too much. Old patterns resurfaced: blame, denial, faith, defiance. And yet, amid the confusion, acts of quiet kindness multiplied. Strangers delivered food to the elderly, singers performed from rooftops, scientists shared data freely across nations. Even in isolation, humanity remembered connection. Imagine a city at dusk in the spring of that year. The streets are deserted, windows flicker with television light. You can hear your own footsteps, a sound once lost beneath traffic. A bus passes, empty, but for the driver. In the distance, a church bell tolls for no congregation. There is fear, yes, but also awe, the feeling of living through history, not as story, but as silence. The scientists worked without rest. In a few short months, the genetic code of the virus was mapped and vaccines were designed, a feat once thought impossible. Messenger RNA, a language written in molecules, became the world's new scripture. When the first doses were administered, there was relief and disbelief in equal measure. Humanity had found a light within the same year the darkness began. It was not perfect, not instant, but it was hope, distilled, clinical, luminous. Still, the losses were immense. Families said goodbye through phone screens, funerals streamed online. Whole nations mourned without touch. Empty chairs at dinner tables became monuments. Behind every number, a life, laughter, stories, unfinished dreams. The grief was collective, yet solitary, stretching across the globe like a long winter that refused to end. When the first lockdowns lifted, people stepped outside as though emerging from another world. The air smelled sharper, the light too bright. Children played in streets grown wild with weeds. Friends embraced with tears and laughter, as though rediscovering an ancient custom. Every ordinary thing, a handshake, a shared meal, the sound of a crowd, felt sacred. The simplest acts became prayers of return. But the silence had changed us. Some feared the noise of normal life, others longed for it desperately. Cities reopened, but something in their rhythm had shifted. We had glimpsed our fragility too clearly to forget it. We understood, perhaps for the first time, that the line between chaos and order is no thicker than a breath. In that quiet aftermath, historians compared COVID-19 to the plagues of old, the Black Death, the Spanish flu, the countless unnamed fevers that came before. And they realized something humbling. Every generation believes its suffering is new, yet the pattern never changes. Isolation, fear, faith, recovery, the same cycle, repeated across centuries, now replayed in real time and high definition. The technology was modern, the emotion was ancient. As the months passed, the world learned to live beside the virus. Masks came and went, vaccines evolved, debates flared and faded. What endured was memory, the image of empty airports, silent cathedrals, and faces glowing in the blue light of screens. The pandemic had shown that humanity's strength was not its speed or invention, but its endurance, the quiet will to continue. Imagine that moment after the storm, the streets still wet with rain, the air washed clean. A woman walks her dog at sunrise, the sound of birds louder than traffic. She pauses, looks around, and feels something both sorrowful and calm. The awareness that life, fragile as glass, has once again survived itself. Perhaps that was the true miracle of 2020, not the vaccines, not the technology, but the rediscovery of stillness. For in the silence of those months, we remembered what the ancients knew, that survival is not victory, but reverence, the science of hope, vaccines, and collective memory. Hope, like disease, spreads unseen. It passes from mind to mind, from act to act, invisible but enduring. After every plague in history, humanity has emerged, blinking into the light, scarred but wiser. The modern age is no different. From the ashes of COVID-19 rose not only new vaccines and tools, but something older, memory, the understanding that survival depends not on isolation alone, but on trust, on cooperation, on the shared promise that no one is truly safe until all are. The story of vaccines is, at its heart, a story of patience. It began centuries before the word existed, when people in ancient China and Africa rubbed dried scabs from smallpox victims into the skin of the healthy, hoping to ward off future illness. Crude, dangerous, yet astonishingly insightful. They did not know about viruses or antibodies, but they understood intuition, that sometimes the path to safety runs through danger itself. In the late 18th century, that intuition found its form. Edward Jenner, an English country doctor, noticed that milkmaids who caught the mild disease of cowpox rarely suffered from smallpox. He took a chance, an experiment that might have seemed madness, and inoculated a young boy with cowpox, then exposed him to smallpox. The boy did not fall ill. The seed of the first true vaccine had been planted. From that quiet act in a small English village grew one of humanity's greatest miracles. Centuries later, when the last known case of smallpox was recorded in Somalia in 1977, bells rang in laboratories and clinics across the world. For the first time, a human disease had been erased, not by divine intervention, but by human cooperation. It was a triumph of persistence, of shared purpose, of science carried on the shoulders of countless anonymous workers, doctors, nurses, villagers, and children, all part of a chain of faith that stretched around the planet. The vaccines that followed for polio, measles, influenza, hepatitis turned the page of history faster than fear could rewrite it. But no discovery erased the old truth. Every cure is fragile, every triumph temporary. Viruses adapt, memory fades, and so the science of hope became not a monument, but a practice, something renewed with each generation, like lighting candles from the embers of the last. When COVID-19 struck, those embers flared again. The technology born from decades of research, messenger RNA, synthetic biology, genomic sequencing, all came together in a single race against time. Within months, vaccines were tested, approved, and distributed. It was not perfection, but it was proof of what humanity could achieve when fear gave way to collaboration. The same science that had once taken centuries now moved at the speed of months. Imagine the first moment a nurse rolled up a sleeve, drew a vial from cold storage, and pressed the needle gently into the skin. The patient inhaled, held still, exhaled. Outside, snow fell softly on hospital glass. For all the technology involved, the act was simple. One human protecting another. Hope distilled into liquid, traveling vein to vein. The vaccines of the modern age carry more than medicine. They carry memory of cities lost to plagues, of families divided by fear, of centuries spent learning the same lesson again and again. Each syringe contains the weight of history, the echo of prayers whispered in isolation huts, the calculations scribbled in candlelight by exhausted doctors. They are the inheritance of suffering turned to salvation. Yet even in triumph, doubt lingers. In every age, some have resisted, fearing what they do not understand. The debates of the modern world echo the same fears that once filled medieval squares: mistrust, confusion, fatigue. Science does not erase the human heart, it only appeals to it. And so the struggle continues, not just against viruses, but against forgetfulness. Public health, like memory, must be tended. It relies on collective belief, on the willingness to protect strangers unseen. It asks us to think beyond our own pulse, to feel the heartbeat of the species as one. For when the needle pierces the skin, it carries not just medicine, but faith in one another. In laboratories now, researchers work toward universal vaccines against influenza, against coronaviruses yet unborn. The walls are lined with freezers that hum quietly, holding samples of everything we have faced and everything we fear. There is no applause in these rooms, no ceremony, only focus. They know what history has taught, that complacency is more dangerous than contagion. And still, outside those labs, the world spins on. Children play, lovers embrace, music drifts again from crowded squares. Each laughter, each breath is an act of defiance, a declaration that life will continue, whatever shape it takes. The lessons of disease linger in the background of ordinary life, invisible but essential, like the immune system itself. Imagine a child decades from now tracing a small scar on their arm, asking what it means. The answer will not be fear, but gratitude, that once the world worked together to make them safe. That, in a time of darkness, humanity found not only a cure, but compassion. That we learned, finally, that our greatest defense has never been medicine alone, but memory shared. And perhaps that is what vaccines truly are, the science of remembering how to care. A promise written not in stone, but in blood, breath, and time, renewed each generation so the world may keep turning in peace. Lessons in fragility. What the dead taught the living, every age of sickness leaves its ruins, not only in the body, but in memory. After the fevers fade and the graves are sealed, the survivors must decide what to remember and what to forget. The dead, silent though they are, remain our greatest teachers. From their absence, we have learned everything that endures: compassion, humility, and the fragile art of living together. History is not written only by the victorious, it is written by the spared. Those who lived through plague and famine carried knowledge not in books, but in behavior, the instinct to wash, to isolate, to share food, to bury carefully, to pray. Long before we had microscopes or vaccines, survival itself was a form of wisdom passed from generation to generation. Even superstition had its logic, born from observation and grief. In a sense, the dead have always been our first scientists. Walk through any old cemetery, and you can read the story of disease in stone, rows of small graves from one terrible year, dates that end too early, carvings of angels with broken wings. Each name is a whisper from a time when survival was uncertain and love meant tending to the sick despite the risk. There is something sacred in those quiet fields, not in their religion, but in their reminder that every comfort we enjoy was bought with suffering once endured. After every great plague, art has changed. Painters turned from glory to tenderness, from kings to faces of ordinary people. Music slowed, grew deeper, more fragile. Writers found beauty in brevity, in the fleeting image of a life interrupted. The Renaissance that followed the Black Death was not only a rebirth of knowledge, it was a rebellion against despair. From the silence of death came the insistence to create, to build, to sing again. Perhaps that is the true rhythm of history: fall, then rise, silence, then song. Each catastrophe humbles us, strips us of illusion, then teaches us to rebuild with gentler hands. We learned hygiene from cholera, empathy from tuberculosis, global cooperation from smallpox, and unity from COVID. The world has always advanced by learning from what broke it. Imagine a mother in medieval Europe standing over the bed of her fevered child. She does not know the cause, only that love demands she stay. Centuries later, in a modern hospital, another mother watches a ventilator breathe for her son. The tools have changed, but the feeling is the same: the helplessness, the endurance, the quiet courage of care. Across time, compassion remains the most constant medicine. The dead have also taught us humility. Each generation believes it has conquered disease, and each is reminded otherwise. The plagues of antiquity, the influenza of 1918, the pandemics of our own age, all reveal the same truth, that progress is never permanent. We live, always, on the edge of the unknown. But perhaps fragility is not weakness. Perhaps it is the source of our humanity. To know that life is delicate is to value it more deeply. In ancient times, survivors built shrines and monuments to the gods of healing. In our time, we build hospitals and research centers. Both are expressions of faith, one spiritual, the other scientific, yet both born from the same desire, to honor the dead by protecting the living. Every vaccine, every hospital ward, every nurse's hand laid on a fevered brow is a continuation of that ancient vow. And what of fear? It too has its lesson. Fear keeps us awake, attentive, cautious. But it must never become cruelty. Many times in history, plagues have made people turn against one another, blaming the foreigner, the poor, the unclean. Yet each time, the cure has come not from division, but from unity. The microbes have no borders, nor should mercy. The modern world, for all its glass and steel, still stands upon the bones of those who came before. Every clean hospital room, every sterile syringe, every doctor's steady hand, all are tributes to centuries of trial and error, of hope and heartbreak. We owe our longevity not only to science, but to the silent endurance of billions who faced death so that others might learn to avoid it. There is a strange beauty in this continuity. The breath you take now carries the same air once inhaled by those who lived through plague, famine, fire. The molecules of their fear and faith still mingle in ours. To live, then, is to participate in an ancient conversation between the living and the dead, a dialogue written not in words, but in resilience. Imagine the world centuries from now. New illnesses will come, some will pass unseen, others will scar the age, but future generations will inherit what we inherited, the memory of survival. They will read of our time the way we read of past centuries, with sorrow, with awe, with gratitude. They will learn from our mistakes as we learned from theirs, and in that chain of remembrance, humanity will continue. In the end, all that the dead have asked of us is to listen, to remember their warnings, their endurance, their quiet grace, to build not higher walls, but deeper compassion, to know that every breath is borrowed, and that the best way to honor life is to use it kindly, for it is the fragile things that last, a heartbeat, a touch, a name carved in stone, and through them the dead continue to speak, reminding us that though the body perishes, the lesson remains, the breath of tomorrow. The world remembers you. The story ends where it began, with a breath, not the fevered gasp of illness, nor the sigh of mourning, but a quiet inhale, the sound of the living. Every era, every continent, every plague has led here, to this fragile moment of peace between one heartbeat and the next. The world turns still, the air moves softly, and for now, we endure. It is tempting to see the history of disease as tragedy, a chain of suffering stretching endlessly through time. And yet, within that darkness, there has always been light. Every discovery, every act of mercy, every candle burned in a sick room has carried humanity forward. The plagues of the past built the medicine of the present. The grief of generations became the architecture of our resilience. Without their pain, we would not know our strength. Look back once more, to the priests of Babylon chanting over fevered kings, to the monks of Byzantium burning incense against the unseen, to the villagers of Ayam sealing their borders with courage, to the masked doctors of Venice walking through fog, to the healers of the New World tending the sick with herbs, to the nurses of 1918 singing softly through exhaustion, to the scientists bent over microscopes, to the faces behind the masks of 2020. Each was a link in the same chain, stretching from the first heartbeat to the last. Each believed, in their own small way, that life was worth saving. The earth has been scarred, but it remembers gently. The fields that once held the dead now bloom again with flowers. Cities once emptied by plague are filled with laughter and motion. The same rivers that carried infection now shimmer with light. The world renews itself endlessly, as if to remind us that nature, though cruel, is never without forgiveness. Imagine standing at dawn on a quiet hill. The grass is wet, the air cool. Below you lies a city stirring awake, the faint sound of traffic, of footsteps, of a child's laughter carried by wind. Each sound, ordinary and small, is a triumph. It means life has continued. It means we have learned. From the ancients, we inherited ritual. From the moderns, reason. But from all ages, we have inherited endurance, that quiet, stubborn refusal to surrender. It is what carried farmers through famine, sailors through storms, doctors through pandemics. It is what carries you, even now, in ways you do not notice. The steady rhythm of the heart, the gentle tide of breath. For all our science, for all our progress, we remain creatures of faith, not in gods or miracles alone, but in one another. Every vaccine, every cure, every act of care is built on trust. Trust that life is worth preserving, that strangers deserve saving, that tomorrow is worth preparing for. This trust is the truest inheritance of all who have lived and died before us. In the archives of medicine there are countless names, some celebrated, most forgotten. But between those names runs a thread of intention, a kind of collective soul. The world remembers not only the famous healers, but the quiet ones, the midwife who stayed beside a fevered mother, the nurse who sang to the dying, the family who shared their last bread with the sick. It remembers them not in monuments, but in habits, the washing of hands, the opening of windows, the care we take with one another. Every generation thinks itself the end of the story, but history moves in circles, not lines. New illnesses will come, as they always have, and when they do, humanity will meet them not with despair, but with remembrance, guided by the lessons of those who came before, because that is what survival truly is. Memory made flesh. There is a tenderness in knowing that life continues through you, that the breath you draw now carries atoms once exhaled by those who faced the Black Death, the influenza, the fires of plague ships. The air remembers. It has moved through centuries of lungs, across oceans and wars, through fear and recovery, only to reach you, here, now, breathing. And so, the story closes not with an ending, but with a return. The circle completes itself. Humanity endures, scarred, wiser, still searching, still loving. We will go on recording, researching, remembering, and when the next darkness falls, we will light the candles again, one by one, as we always have. So, take a moment now, breathe, listen to the quiet hum of your own heart. It is the same rhythm that carried the first healer through his vigil, the same pulse that echoed beneath every mask, every prayer, every whispered goodbye. You are part of that unbroken chain, and if you ever doubt the meaning of survival, remember this. It was never only about living longer, but living wiser, gentler, more aware of the gift we share. Because every breath, every touch, every dawn still rising after the storm is a small miracle. And though the centuries are filled with loss, they are also filled with love. The world remembers you. It always has. It always will.